Sometimes people who shout the loudest about rules are the ones who know the least about them, and Karen was about to discover that in a way she would never forget. The sun had barely risen over the quiet lakeside community when she set out on her latest mission. To her, the neighborhood wasn't just a place to live, it was her kingdom, her domain, her stage where she performed the role of protector of standards. The homeowners association had rules, and in her mind, those rules were sacred. She lived for them, quoted them like scripture, and wielded them like weapons against anyone who dared to be different. That Saturday morning was no different. She dressed in her HOA armor, a wide-brimmed sun visor that made her look like a tennis player who had retired 20 years ago, oversized sunglasses that covered half her face, and a floral blouse tucked neatly into khaki shorts. Clutched in her hand was her ever-present clipboard, filled with notes about violations, observations, and things that, in her opinion, threatened the integrity of the community. Her target today was Marcus. Marcus had moved into the neighborhood, only a few months ago buying a property right by the lake. He was a tall, broad-shouldered black man with a calm, measured way about him. He wasn't loud, didn't bother anyone, and carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who didn't need to prove anything. Most of the neighbors hardly knew him, but those who had seen him described him as polite, respectful, and easygoing. He kept his property neat, his lawn trimmed, and his home immaculate. Yet to Karen, that wasn't enough. The problem, in her eyes, was the boat. Marcus owned a modest fishing boat. It wasn't flashy or extravagant, just a small vessel perfect for calm mornings on the water. He kept it tied neatly to the dock behind his property, positioned carefully so it never drifted out of place. To anyone else, it was harmless. In fact, it blended into the lake's atmosphere beautifully. But to Karen, it was an eyesore. This is how neighborhoods lose their value, she muttered to herself as she stomped down the gravel path that led toward Marcus's dock. First, a boat. Then someone will park an RV. Next thing you know, property values drop and everyone blames the HOA for not keeping things in order. Not on my watch. She walked briskly, her visor bobbing with every step, her sandals crunching against the pebbles. Her face was set in determination, the kind of look she wore whenever she believed she was saving the neighborhood from collapse. Meanwhile, Marcus was sitting on a folding chair by the dock, working on his fishing line. The morning air was crisp, the lake water calm and glittering under the sun. He loved this time of day, when the world was still waking up, and the only sounds were the occasional birdsong and the gentle ripple of the water. To him, the boat wasn't just transportation, it was part of his peace. It was how he connected with the lake, how he breathed after long weeks of work. He noticed Karen approaching, though he didn't react right away. He'd already seen her type around the neighborhood, the ones who watched everyone like hawks, ready to pounce on anything they didn't approve of. He'd ignored her stares from a distance before, but now, as she closed in with that smug little smile plastered across her face, he knew she wasn't coming down for a friendly chat. "Excuse me," Karen barked, her voice cutting through the serene air like a car alarm in the middle of the night. Marcus looked up slowly, his hands still steady on the fishing line. "Morning," he said, his tone calm and even. Karen planted her hands on her hips, the clipboard tucked firmly under her arm. "I'm going to make this simple for you. You can't leave your boat tied up here. It's against the HOA's aesthetic guidelines. The lake is a shared community feature, not your personal storage unit. You'll need to move it immediately." For a moment, Marcus just stared at her. Not in anger, not even in annoyance, but in quiet disbelief at her audacity. The boat wasn't bothering anyone. It was neatly tied, didn't obstruct the dock, and wasn't covered in rust or peeling paint. Yet here she was, trying to dictate where he could or couldn't keep it. "I don't think that's going to be a problem," Marcus replied evenly. His voice was calm, measured, like someone who had been here before and knew exactly how to handle people like her. Karen mistook his calm for compliance. She tilted her chin higher, her smile tightening like a vice. Good. I'm glad you understand. We can't have people thinking they can just clutter up the lake with whatever they please. The community has rules, and if everyone started bringing boats, kayaks, or jet skis, this place would be a circus. We expect it gone by next week. She spun on her heel, already congratulating herself for another successful enforcement of the rules. She muttered under her breath about standards and keeping the neighborhood decent, as if she had just saved the entire community from collapse. Marcus, however, watched her walk away, his lips curling into the faintest smile. He hadn't raised his voice, he hadn't argued. But inside, he was already shaking his head. What Karen didn't know, what almost no one in the neighborhood knew, was that Marcus wasn't just some man who had bought a house by the water. When he purchased the property, he had carefully reviewed every detail of the deed. It wasn't just the house and the land he had acquired. The purchase had included full ownership of the lake itself. Every square foot of water, every dock, every fishing right, legally belonged to him. The HOA had no control over it. None of their rules, none of their guidelines, none of their threats carried any weight over what happened on that lake. Marcus had smiled when he discovered that during the buying process, knowing it gave him a quiet kind of power. But he had never abused it. He let the neighborhood use the lake freely. He never charged anyone, never restricted fishing, never said a word about their noisy summer barbecues or their fishing club tournaments. But now, after Karen had the nerve to march down to his dock and order him to move his boat as if she owned him, that patience was wearing thin. Karen didn't realize that by picking this fight, she was lighting a fuse, and when it burned down, she and her beloved HOA would feel the explosion. Marcus sat back in his chair, looking out over the calm water, his fishing rod balanced across his lap. The lake shimmered, reflecting the rising sun. It was his lake, his sanctuary, and if Karen wanted to challenge him here, she was about to learn what it really meant to play by the rules. His rules. He chuckled softly to himself, shaking his head. He wasn't a man who sought out trouble, but when it came knocking, he had no problem handling it. Karen thought she had authority. She thought the HOA was untouchable. But soon, she was going to find out just how powerless her clipboard and her smug attitude really were. The fishing club the HOA loved so much, the one they paraded as the pride of the neighborhood, operated entirely on his property. The club held its tournaments on his docks, launched boats from his shore, and reeled in fish from his lake, all without asking him for permission. He had let it slide because he didn't care. But now it was leverage. Marcus leaned back, closed his eyes for a moment, and smiled as the sun warmed his face. He didn't need to rush. He didn't need to argue. The truth was on his side, and the power was already his. Karen thought she had won a battle that morning. She strutted back, home feeling triumphant, certain she had put Marcus in his place. But in reality, she had just declared war, and she didn't even know it, because the lake didn't belong to the community. It didn't belong to the HOA. It didn't belong to Karen. It belonged to Marcus. The courthouse always carried a weight that pressed down on anyone who walked through its doors. The high ceilings, the echo of footsteps against marble floors, the hushed whispers of people waiting for cases to be called. It was a place where lives were dismantled, where truths were revealed, and where justice either stood tall or crumbled under lies. For Karen Whitmore, it was just another building she believed she could manipulate her way through. She had walked in that morning as though she owned the place, her chin high, her beige suit sharp and pressed, her hair pinned perfectly back. She had lived her life skating through consequences, brushing off complaints, and bending people to her will with a mix of arrogance and intimidation. To her, this would be no different. She believed the trial was a formality, a temporary inconvenience. Yes, people whispered about her. Yes, she had been arrested. But in her mind, she would walk out with nothing more than probation, maybe a fine. She told herself the world was still the same, that she was still untouchable. As she clutched her leather handbag and marched into the courtroom, she rehearsed her usual excuses. It was an accident. I wasn't even there. Someone must have mistaken me for someone else. This is all a misunderstanding. She had used similar lines before when neighbors tried to hold her accountable for her HOA harassment. Why wouldn't it work now? But as the doors creaked open and she stepped inside, Karen's confidence cracked. The air shifted. Conversations hushed. And when her eyes landed on the man walking toward the prosecution's table, her heart sank to the pit of her stomach. Marcus Green. He wasn't supposed to be there. Not like this, not dressed in a perfectly tailored Navy suit, not standing with the authority of someone who belonged in that room more than anyone else. She had always thought of him as the quiet man at the edge of the neighborhood, the one who worked long hours, came home late, kept to himself. She knew he was smart, capable, but she never once considered that he could stand here, in this arena, with the full weight of the law behind him. Her throat went dry. The memory of his burning house flashed in her mind, the way the flames lit up the night sky. She had told herself no one would ever tie it back to her, that even if suspicion fell on her shoulders, she could talk her way out of it. But now, standing across from Marcus, she realized she was trapped in a web she had spun herself. Marcus didn't look at her the way she expected. He didn't glare, didn't spit anger with his eyes. Instead, his expression was calm, collected, almost surgical. His gaze wasn't filled with hatred. It was filled with purpose. And in that courtroom, purpose was more dangerous than rage when the judge entered. The room stood in silence, and the trial began. The defense attorney Karen had hired, an expensive man with slicked back hair and a silver tongue, rose to speak first, insisting that there was absolutely no concrete evidence tying Ms. Whitmore to the alleged arson. He painted her as a victim of neighborhood gossip, a woman unfairly targeted because of her position in the HOA. He spoke smoothly, gesturing gracefully, appealing to the jury's sense of fairness. But then Marcus stood. The shift was immediate. He didn't need theatrics, didn't need to raise his voice. His presence alone demanded attention. Every juror's eyes fixed on him, and even the judge leaned slightly forward. Marcus began with a calm statement, laying out who he was, his connection to the case, and why he had chosen to prosecute despite the personal nature of the crime. Because this isn't just about a house, he said, his voice steady. It's about hate. It's about abuse of power. It's about a woman who believed she could destroy a man's life simply because she didn't like who he was. He moved methodically, presenting evidence piece by piece. Surveillance footage showed Karen's car creeping down the street just minutes before the fire. A neighbor testified about overhearing her say, "That house ruins the neighborhood," only days earlier. Another recalled seeing her lingering near Marcus's yard, pacing as if she were waiting for something. And then came the fire marshal's report, detailing traces of accelerant found near the foundation of Marcus's home. Every fact was a nail, every testimony a hammer, and Marcus drove them in, one by one, constructing a picture so clear the jury could not look away. Karen shifted, uncomfortably, her hands gripping the edges of the defense table. She whispered frantically to her lawyer, who tried to object whenever possible, but Marcus was prepared for everything. Every objection was countered with calm precision. Every attempt to derail him only highlighted how unshakable he was. The most damning moment came when Marcus called the final witness, a teenager from the neighborhood, quiet and nervous as he stepped up to the stand. Marcus's tone softened as he asked his questions, guiding the boy gently. The teenager revealed he had been out late walking his dog and had seen Karen that night, standing in Marcus's driveway with a gas can. The boy's voice wavered, but the truth in his words settled heavily in the room. When asked why he hadn't come forward sooner, the boy admitted he was afraid of Karen, afraid of the way she had intimidated people for years. The courtroom murmured. The image of Karen Whitmore, the HOA tyrant, wielding fear like a weapon, was no longer a private truth whispered among neighbors. It was now official record. Through it all, Marcus never once raised his voice, never once cracked under pressure. He laid out the facts with the patience of a craftsman, letting the evidence speak louder than anger ever could. He wanted the jury to see not just what Karen had done, but why she had done it. That her actions were not random, not impulsive, but born from a long history of targeted harassment and prejudice. Karen tried to keep her composure, but her mask slipped. She glared at Marcus, her lips trembling, her jaw clenched so tightly it looked like it might snap. She whispered to herself, shaking her head, as though she could rewrite reality by sheer willpower. But the jury wasn't looking at her anymore. They were looking at Marcus, at the man who had lost everything in a single night, yet stood tall, in the very room where she thought she would walk free. By the end of the second day, the defense attorney's argument sounded hollow. He tried to paint Karen as misunderstood, as a woman unfairly targeted, but the evidence piled too high against her. Each time Marcus rose, the jury leaned in, as though he was the only voice in the room that mattered. He didn't just speak. As a lawyer, he spoke as a man who had lived the consequences of her hatred, and when he gave his closing argument, the room held its breath. Marcus didn't talk about vengeance. He didn't talk about punishment. He talked about accountability. He spoke about the danger of allowing hate to go unchecked, about the responsibility of the community to stand against those who used power to harm rather than protect. "This isn't about me," he said finally, his voice resonating with quiet strength. "This is about ensuring no one else has to live in fear of someone like her. This is about making sure justice isn't just a word we throw around in this courtroom, but a truth we live by." Silence filled the air when he sat down. The jury members exchanged glances, their faces heavy with the weight of what they had heard. Even the judge's expression had softened, as though he too recognized the gravity of Marcus's words. Karen, for the first time in her life, felt the walls close in around her. She wasn't in control anymore. She couldn't bully her way out. Couldn't find someone into silence, couldn't hide behind her HOA title. For years, she had thought of Marcus as beneath her. But here, in this room, with the law on his side and the truth laid bare, she realized the most terrifying thing. Of all, he had always been above her. The jury was sent to deliberate, and Karen sat frozen, her confidence drained, her mind racing. She tried to convince herself that she still had a chance, that maybe one or two jurors would side with her, that somehow she would walk free. But deep down, she knew. She had lit the match that night, and now Marcus had held it up for the world to see. When the jurors filed out, Karen's eyes darted to Marcus one last time. He didn't look at her with hatred. He didn't even look satisfied. He looked resolute, steady, unbreakable. And that unnerved her more than anything else, because in that moment she understood that whether the jury said guilty or not guilty, Marcus had already won. He hadn't just survived her fire. He had turned it into the light that exposed her for who she truly was. The room was so quiet that every sound seemed magnified. The shuffling of papers, the creak of wooden benches, the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. It had been hours since the jury retreated to deliberate, hours of restless waiting that stretched like an eternity. Marcus sat at the prosecution's table, hands folded neatly in front of him, outwardly calm, but inwardly steadying himself for the moment that would define everything. He had built an unshakable case, presented every fact, every testimony with precision, but he knew that the final decision no longer rested with him. It rested with 12 strangers, and strangers could be unpredictable. Karen sat a few feet away, her once confident posture crumbled. Her shoulders slouched, her hands clenched into fists in her lap, her face pale beneath layers of carefully applied makeup. For the first time, the queen of the HOA looked powerless. The smugness she had carried, into the courthouse on the first day had been stripped away piece by piece until nothing remained but a hollow shell. Still, Marcus didn't let himself look at her often. He didn't need to. This wasn't about watching her fall. It was about something bigger. The bailiff's voice broke the silence. "All rise." The words echoed through the courtroom, heavy with finality. The jury filed back in, their expressions solemn, their eyes betraying nothing. Each step they took seemed to shake the ground beneath Karen. She gripped the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles whitened, staring at them with wide, desperate eyes. Marcus rose with quiet dignity, straightening his suit, breathing deeply through his nose. He kept his gaze fixed on the foreman, the man clutching the small folded piece of paper that held Karen's fate. The judge cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict?" The foreman nodded. "We have, Your Honor." His voice was steady, his words sharp in the stillness. He handed the folded slip of paper to the bailiff, who in turn passed it to the judge. The judge read silently, then gave a small nod before returning the slip. "Please read the verdict." The foreman unfolded the paper slowly, the entire courtroom leaning forward in anticipation. Karen's lips trembled as she whispered to herself, as though prayers could rewrite the truth. The foreman looked up and spoke clearly. On the charge of arson, we find the defendant, Karen Whitmore, guilty. On the charge of reckless endangerment, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of hate-motivated harassment, we find the defendant guilty. Gasps rippled through the room, followed by whispers that rose and fell like waves. Karen let out a sharp, broken sound, a gasp mixed with a sob. She shook her head furiously, her voice cracking as she muttered, No, this isn't right. This isn't fair! I didn't—" Her words fell into chaos as tears smeared her mascara. The gavel struck hard against the wood, silencing the noise. "Order in the court," the judge commanded. Marcus didn't move, didn't gloat, didn't let triumph distort his face. He simply closed his eyes for a brief second, inhaling deeply. Relief washed through him, not the wild rush of victory, but the deep, grounding weight of justice finally done. It wasn't joy, because nothing could undo what he had lost, but it was resolution. It was proof that truth, no matter how buried, could not be silenced forever. The judge sentenced her to years in prison, his words deliberate and firm. "Ms. Whitmore, your actions were not just reckless, they were malicious. You sought to destroy not only a man's home, but his very sense of safety, his place in this community. This court cannot allow such behavior to go unpunished." The ED bailiff stepped forward, pulling Karen to her feet. She resisted, her body shaking, her voice shrill as she turned toward Marcus. "You did this to me," she screamed, her voice echoing through the chamber. "You ruined my life." Her eyes locked onto his, wild with rage and desperation. She wanted to see hatred in his face, wanted to believe she still had the power to make him angry. But Marcus only looked at her with something far more devastating: pity. His eyes were steady, unflinching, filled with the quiet knowledge that she had destroyed herself long before this trial. He didn't need to say anything. His silence was louder than any words could be. The bailiff pulled her away, her cries fading as she was escorted through the doors and into the shadows of the justice system she had mocked for so long. The sound of those doors slamming shut behind her was final, like the last note of a song. When the courtroom cleared, reporters swarmed in the hallway, their cameras flashing, their microphones reaching. Questions flew at Marcus. How does it feel to see justice served? Do you think this will set a precedent for hate crimes? What's next for you after losing your home? He paused, his daughter's small hand clutching his. She had been sitting quietly in the back of the courtroom, watched over by a close family friend, and now she ran to him with wide, tearful eyes. Marcus knelt, scooping her into his arms, her warmth grounding him in a way no verdict ever could. He kissed her forehead gently before answering the reporters. "I didn't come here for revenge," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I came here for accountability. My house may be gone, but what matters most is that my daughter and I are safe. Justice isn't about what you lose. It's about ensuring no one else has to lose in the same way." That's what this was about. The cameras flashed again. The crowd buzzed with his words, but Marcus tuned them out. He carried his daughter through the doors and into the sunlight outside. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he could breathe without the weight of smoke in his lungs. In the days that followed, the neighborhood shifted. Neighbors who once looked away now approached him, offering apologies, condolences, even support. Some admitted they had been too afraid to stand up to Karen before, too worried about her retaliation. Marcus accepted their words with grace, but he didn't linger on them. He knew fear had silenced them, and he had no interest in dwelling on what couldn't be changed. He had only one focus now: rebuilding, not just a house, but a life. Reconstruction began slowly. Marcus returned to the lot where his home had once stood, now nothing but scorched earth and charred remnants. He stood there for hours, imagining what would rise in its place. His daughter tugged on his sleeve and said, "Daddy, can we make it even better this time?" He smiled, tears welling in his eyes, and nodded. "Yes, baby girl, even better." The community rallied behind him, in ways he hadn't expected. Volunteers showed up with tools, neighbors donated materials, and strangers from outside the neighborhood sent funds and supplies after hearing his story. The same ground that had been blackened with hate began to bloom again with resilience. Brick by brick, wall by wall, Marcus rebuilt, not just a home, but a message to anyone watching. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, Marcus stood on the new porch, holding his daughter in his arms. The smell of fresh wood and paint filled the air, replacing the acrid memory of smoke. He looked at the rising structure, proud not because it was perfect, but because it symbolized survival. His daughter nestled her head against his shoulder and whispered, "We're safe now, right?" Marcus tightened his hold and kissed her hair. "Yes, sweetheart, we're safe, and we'll always be safe as long as we stand strong together." Karen's name faded from conversations over time. She became a cautionary tale, a reminder of what hate could destroy, but also of what it could never conquer. Marcus didn't think of her often, but when he did, it wasn't with bitterness. It was with the knowledge that she had given him something she never intended. A chance to prove not just to her, but to the world, that he could rise from ashes stronger than before. And as he stood there on that porch, the laughter of his daughter echoing into the twilight, Marcus knew the fire hadn't ended his story. It had only rewritten it. What had started in flames had ended in triumph, not because the house had been rebuilt, but because he had shown his daughter, his community, and himself that no amount of hate could burn away dignity, courage, or love. The chapter of destruction was closed. The chapter of renewal had begun.